"Don't pay too much attention to Margaret," my daughter-in-law whispered near the guest book table. "She's just being dramatic today." I heard every single word the moment I stepped inside the funeral home carrying the navy blue sweater my husband used to love on cold mornings. The room suddenly felt smaller, quieter, colder somehow, even though nearly 100 people filled the chapel with low voices and the smell of fresh lilies. For 42 years, Richard Whitmore had been my husband. For 42 years, he had been the first person to reach for my hand in crowded rooms. And now, less than 72 hours after his passing, I was standing 10 feet away while my own daughter-in-law explained my grief to strangers like I was some unstable old woman who needed to be managed. I stopped walking for a moment, clutching my purse so tightly my fingers ached. Jessica didn't know I had hurt her. She stood near the front entrance in a fitted black dress, greeting guests with practiced sympathy, touching elbows gently, lowering her voice at exactly the right moments. She looked more like the widow than I did. People kept hugging her first. "Jessica has handled everything beautifully," one woman whispered as I passed. Another guest leaned toward me with an awkward smile and said, "You should try to rest today, Margaret." Rest. As if I were recovering from a cold instead of burying the man I loved since 1979. I glanced toward Richard's framed photograph near the altar. They had chosen a picture I'd never even seen before. Jessica probably picked it herself. In the photo, Richard wore a gray suit and a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. My Richard smiled differently around me. Softer. Warmer. Real. But somehow even that had already been replaced. "Margaret," Jessica suddenly said brightly as she approached me, her heels clicking softly across the marble floor. "You made it." Made it. Like I was a distant relative instead of Richard's wife. She adjusted the tissue box beside the guest book and lowered her voice. "Try not to upset yourself too much today, okay? Daniel's already stressed." I stared at her for a second, unable to answer. Behind her, guests continued arriving with casseroles, sympathy cards, and carefully rehearsed condolences. And for the first time since my husband died, I realized something far worse than grief was waiting for me inside that chapel. Someone had already started rewriting my place in my own family. The service had not even started yet, and somehow I already felt like a guest at my own husband's funeral. I stood near the hallway leading to the chapel while Jessica moved through the room with the confidence of someone hosting a charity banquet instead of mourning a man who had died 3 days earlier. Every few minutes she adjusted something. A flower arrangement. A framed photograph. The seating cards near the front row. She kept smoothing invisible wrinkles from her dress, and speaking in that soft, controlled voice people use when they want to appear compassionate. "Richard would have wanted something elegant," she told the funeral director while barely looking at me. I noticed then that my seat had been moved. Originally, the front row held 5 reserved chairs. 1 for me. 1 for Daniel. 2 for Richard's sisters who had flown in from Arizona. And 1 for Pastor Reynolds. But now there were only 4 chairs centered neatly in front of the casket, and mine had been pushed slightly toward the aisle. Jessica's seat sat directly beside Daniel's, close enough for guests to assume she was the center of the family now. I stared at the row for several seconds before quietly asking, "Was there a mistake?" Jessica glanced over with a sympathetic smile that never reached her eyes. "Oh no, Margaret. I just thought this arrangement flowed better for receiving guests afterward." Flowed better. As though my marriage could be reorganized like table decorations. Before I could respond, another couple approached us carrying a casserole dish wrapped in foil. Jessica immediately stepped forward. "Thank you so much for coming," she said warmly, placing her hand over her chest. "This week has been incredibly hard on Daniel." "Not on me. On Daniel." I stood there listening while strangers nodded at her with pity and admiration. One woman squeezed Jessica's arm and whispered, "You are being so strong. Through all this." Jessica lowered her eyes modestly. "I am trying." I felt invisible. Completely invisible. Richard and I built our entire life together in a modest 2-story home outside Hartford. We survived layoffs, hospital scares, mortgage payments, and 42 New England winters together. Yet somehow, in less than one morning, I had become an accessory to my own grief while my daughter-in-law carefully positioned herself as the grieving heart of the family. Then I overheard something else. Near the coffee station, Jessica leaned toward two distant relatives and quietly said, "Margaret has not been handling things very well emotionally. We are all trying to keep today peaceful." Peaceful. As if I were the threat in the room. One of the women looked over at me with visible concern, and that was the moment I understood Jessica had been preparing this narrative long before I arrived. By the time the memorial service officially began, I no longer felt like Richard's wife. I felt like someone being politely tolerated at an event arranged for other people. Soft piano music filled the chapel while guests settled into their seats, whispering quietly and unfolding funeral programs Jessica had designed herself. I noticed immediately that my name appeared halfway down the inside panel under special thanks. Halfway down, beneath the catering company and flower arrangements. Jessica's name, meanwhile, appeared directly under Daniel's at the top of the family section. I stared at the paper in my trembling hands while people around me dabbed their eyes and murmured about how beautiful everything looked. Richard would have hated this performance. He was a simple man. He loved grilled hamburgers in the backyard, old baseball games, and coffee at 6 every morning sharp. He never cared about elegant centerpieces or custom prayer cards printed on expensive cream-colored paper. But Jessica cared deeply about appearances. She always had. I remembered the first Thanksgiving after Daniel married her. She replaced my homemade table decorations while I was still cooking because she said the house needed a more modern feel. Richard had squeezed my hand under the table afterward and whispered, "Do not let her turn this place into a hotel lobby." At the time we laughed about it. Standing inside that chapel now, I realized he had been warning me for years in ways I never fully understood. Pastor Reynolds approached the podium and welcomed everyone with a solemn expression. As he spoke, Jessica leaned closer to Daniel, touching his arm gently every few minutes while guests looked toward them with sympathy. My own son barely looked at me at all. He seemed exhausted, distracted, almost afraid to meet my eyes. Then came the moment that truly unsettled me. Pastor Reynolds began thanking family members who had helped organize the service. "Jessica Whitmore has done an extraordinary job honoring Richard's memory," he said warmly. Several people nodded in agreement. Someone behind me even whispered, "She held this whole family together." I felt my chest tighten. I had spent 3 nights sleeping in the same hospital chair beside Richard while machines beeped softly in the dark. I was the one who held his hand during his final hours. I was the one who brushed his hair back and told him it was all right to rest. Yet somehow none of that mattered in this room. Jessica had controlled the story before anyone else even had the chance to speak. Then I noticed something else. The easel beside Richard's casket displayed family photographs from vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays spanning decades. But in almost every single picture, I had either been cropped out or replaced by newer photos featuring Daniel and Jessica. 42 years of marriage reduced to the edges of framed photographs while my daughter-in-law stood smiling at the center of nearly every display. And suddenly, for the first time that day, grief was no longer the strongest thing I felt. After the service ended, guests slowly filtered into the reception hall beside the chapel where coffee, sandwiches, and small pastries had been arranged across long white tables. Richard would have laughed at how formal it all looked. He hated cucumber sandwiches. He used to call them food for people pretending to be hungry. The memory almost made me smile until I noticed Jessica, standing near the center of the room, effortlessly gathering people around her again. She moved through conversations like someone campaigning for public office, touching shoulders lightly, lowering her voice at perfect moments, accepting sympathy with graceful little nods. Every time someone approached me, she somehow appeared nearby within seconds. "Margaret has had such a difficult time coping," she quietly explained to one older couple from our church. "We are trying to make sure she does not overwhelm herself today." I stood 3 feet away while she spoke about me as though I were not fully capable of hearing or understanding my own life. The couple looked at me carefully afterward, their smiles tight with concern. "Maybe you should sit down for a bit," the woman suggested gently. "Sit down. Rest. Stay calm." Every interaction carried the same message now. Poor Margaret. Fragile Margaret. Emotional Margaret. Jessica had wrapped me inside a narrative so carefully constructed that even kindness started feeling insulting. I walked toward the photo display again, needing a moment away from the noise. The closer I looked, the stranger it became. Entire years of my marriage were missing. No photographs from our 25th anniversary trip to Maine. None from the summers Richard spent rebuilding our back porch by hand. None from Christmas mornings where he wore ridiculous reindeer pajamas just to embarrass Daniel when he was little. Instead, the display focused heavily on recent years. Jessica and Daniel hosting dinner parties. Jessica beside Richard at charity events. Jessica cutting cake beside him at birthdays I had actually planned myself. It looked less like a memorial for my husband, and more like a quiet replacement of me. Beautiful tribute, is it not? Jessica suddenly appeared beside me holding a paper coffee cup. I wanted everyone to remember Richard at his happiest. Her voice sounded sweet enough to fool anyone listening. I kept staring at the photographs. You left out a lot, I said quietly. For just a second her expression tightened. Barely noticeable. Then the smile returned. Well, we had limited space. Limited space. 42 years reduced. By lack of space. Before I could answer, Daniel approached looking exhausted. Mom, are you okay? He asked softly. But even he sounded cautious now, like he had already been warned to handle me carefully. Jessica touched his arm immediately. She is just having a hard moment, she said gently. Today has been very emotional for her. Daniel nodded slowly without questioning it, without defending me, without even realizing what was happening right in front of him. And standing there beside the man I raised, I suddenly understood something devastating. Jessica was not only controlling the funeral anymore. She was controlling how my own family saw me. The reception hall grew louder as more people arrived from the cemetery, but the noise only made me feel more alone. Conversations blurred together into soft laughter, coffee cups clinking, chairs scraping lightly against polished floors. Every now and then someone approached me with careful sympathy, but even those moments felt rehearsed now, like they had already been warned what version of me they were expected to encounter. How are you holding up? They would ask slowly, watching my face too carefully. Jessica said this has been especially hard on you. Especially hard on me. The words stayed with me because they sounded harmless on the surface, but underneath them was something far more dangerous. Jessica had managed to transform normal grief into evidence that I was unstable, emotional, difficult. I began noticing the small shifts everywhere. When I stood quietly near a window for too long, people checked on me. When I sighed heavily after looking at Richard's photograph, conversations nearby suddenly softened. At one point I reached for a napkin after tearing up slightly, and one of Daniel's coworkers immediately whispered, "Maybe someone should take Margaret home soon." Home. Away from my own husband's funeral. Jessica had not openly attacked me once all day. That was the genius of it. She never raised her voice. Never insulted me directly. She simply guided people toward conclusions while pretending to protect me. She has not slept much. She gets overwhelmed easily. We are trying to keep things calm. For her. Every sentence sounded caring while quietly removing my dignity piece by piece. I finally stepped outside for air near the side entrance of the funeral home. The late afternoon sky hung gray over the parking lot, and cold wind rustled through the bare trees beside the building. For a few seconds I closed my eyes and imagined Richard standing beside me like he always used to after difficult family gatherings. He had a habit of squeezing my shoulder twice whenever he knew I was upset. 2 quick squeezes. That was his way of saying, "I see it too." Suddenly I remembered a conversation from almost 2 years earlier after Daniel and Jessica hosted Christmas dinner. Richard had been unusually quiet during the drive home. Finally he said, "Jess likes controlling how people see things." I asked him what he meant and he shrugged. "You notice how everyone ends up apologizing to her eventually? Even when she starts the problem." At the time I brushed it off because I wanted peace in the family. Richard loved Daniel deeply, and I convinced myself small tensions were normal. But standing outside that funeral home, I realized something painful. Richard had seen this side of Jessica long before I did. And maybe he had tried to warn me in the only ways he knew how. Then the side door opened behind me. Jessica stepped outside holding her coat closed against the wind, and gave me a patient smile that instantly made my stomach tighten. "There you are," she said softly. "People were starting to worry about you again." Jessica stood beside me near the side entrance with the kind of expression people use when pretending to be patient with someone difficult. Inside the reception hall, I could still hear the muffled hum of conversation and silverware clinking softly against plates. Guests were eating miniature pastries and sharing stories about Richard, while I stood outside feeling like a problem that needed managing. "You should probably come back inside," Jessica said gently, pulling her coat tighter around herself. "People notice when you disappear suddenly." I looked at her carefully. Even now, every sentence sounded helpful on the surface. But underneath it was always the same message. Behave properly. Do not embarrass us. Do not become inconvenient. "I just needed air," I replied quietly. "Of course," she said immediately, nodding with practiced understanding. "Everyone grieves differently." Then she lowered her voice slightly. "I just worry some people might misunderstand emotional moments today." Emotional moments. There it was again. She never directly called me unstable because she did not need to. She simply repeated variations of the same idea until everyone else did it for her. I turned away from her and looked across the nearly empty parking lot. Richard's old Ford pickup truck was still parked near the far curb because Daniel had driven it there that morning. Seeing it sitting alone under the gray sky suddenly hit me harder than the funeral itself. Richard loved that truck more than any sensible person should. Every Saturday morning he washed it by hand even during cold Connecticut winters while complaining about how modern cars all looked like angry toasters. For a moment, I could almost hear his laugh again. My throat tightened painfully. "Richard used to say funerals are more about the living than the dead," I said softly without looking at Jessica. "He hated performances." Silence lingered between us for a second too long. Then Jessica smiled faintly. "Well, everyone thinks today turned out beautifully." Everyone. The word landed heavily because I already knew she was right. Inside that building, people admired her. They trusted her version of events. Meanwhile, I had become the grieving widow people watched cautiously from across the room. Suddenly the side door opened again and Pastor Reynolds stepped outside carrying a folder under his arm. "Margaret," he said warmly, relieved to see me. "I have been looking for you." Jessica's posture shifted almost instantly, subtle but noticeable. "Is everything all right?" she asked before I could answer. Pastor Reynolds nodded. "Actually, yes. There was something Richard left with the funeral director a few months ago. He specifically requested that Margaret receive it personally." For the first time all day, Jessica looked genuinely caught off guard. It lasted only a second before her smile returned, but I saw it clearly. A small crack. A flicker of uncertainty. Pastor Reynolds handed me a sealed ivory envelope with Richard's handwriting across the front. My fingers trembled the moment I recognized it. Because after 42 years of marriage, I knew my husband's handwriting better than my own. For several seconds I could not move. The ivory envelope felt heavier than paper should have felt, and suddenly the cold air outside no longer mattered. All I could see was Richard's handwriting across the front in dark blue ink. "For Margaret." Simple. Familiar. Unmistakably his. Pastor Reynolds gave me a gentle nod before stepping back toward the building, clearly understanding this was private. Jessica, however, remained beside me. I could feel her attention fixed on the envelope even though she tried to appear casual. "I did not know Richard left anything," she said carefully. Her voice still sounded calm, but the smooth confidence she carried all afternoon had weakened slightly. I ran my thumb along the sealed edge without opening it yet. Strange memories flooded my mind all at once. Richard sitting at the kitchen table balancing bills while humming old Frank Sinatra songs. Richard asleep in his recliner with the television still on. Richard insisting on shoveling snow himself even after his doctor warned him about his heart. 42 years together creates thousands of ordinary moments that become priceless after someone is gone. And suddenly I realized how fiercely Jessica had tried to erase those years from the room inside. "Margaret," Jessica asked softly, "maybe you should wait until you are home to read it." There it was again. Another gentle instruction disguised as concern. Another quiet attempt to control the moment before it fully belonged to me. I finally looked directly at her. "Why?" I asked calmly. She blinked once, clearly not expecting resistance from me. "Well," she said slowly, "you have been emotional today, and I just would not want anything to upset you further in front of guests." Emotional. Upset. Yes. Every word carefully chosen. But something inside me had started changing the moment I saw Richard's handwriting. For the first time all day, I no longer felt confused about what Jessica was doing. I saw it clearly now. The constant soft corrections, the careful explanations to others, the way she positioned herself between me and every conversation. She had spent the entire funeral managing perception. And the terrifying part was how easily people accepted it because she never sounded cruel while doing it. The side door opened again and Daniel stepped outside looking tired and pale. "Mom," he said, relieved to find me. Then he noticed the envelope in my hands. "What is that?" Before I could answer, Jessica spoke smoothly. "Apparently your father left Margaret a private note." Daniel frowned slightly. "Dad never mentioned that." I almost laughed at the irony. Richard probably had not mentioned it because lately nobody in the family seemed allowed private thoughts unless Jessica approved them first. Daniel looked at me uncertainly. "Are you okay?" he asked again, using the same cautious tone everyone else had adopted with me all day. I stared at my son for a long moment before answering quietly. "I think your father wanted to make sure I remembered something important. And for reasons I could not fully explain yet, I suddenly knew that whatever was inside that envelope had the power to change the entire atmosphere of that funeral." I waited until I was alone before opening the envelope. The reception hall had become crowded again, so I quietly slipped into the small family lounge near the back corridor of the funeral home. The room smelled faintly like old coffee and furniture polish, and a single lamp cast soft yellow light across the leather chairs. For the first time all day, nobody was watching me carefully. Nobody was correcting my emotions. Nobody was explaining me to other people. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter. Richard's handwriting covered both sides of the page in the neat block print he always used whenever something mattered deeply to him. "Margaret," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am probably already gone, and knowing you, you are trying very hard not to make anyone uncomfortable with your grief." I felt tears sting my eyes. Instantly, because that sounded exactly like him. Richard always noticed the things nobody else did. I kept reading slowly. "I need you to remember something important. You do not owe anyone silence just because they speak softly." My breath caught. Outside the lounge, I could hear distant conversation and muted laughter from guests finishing lunch, but suddenly the entire world felt very far away. "I have watched certain dynamics in this family for years," the letter continued. "And I know you tend to excuse behavior in the name of keeping peace. But peace is not real when one person slowly disappears inside it." I lowered the paper for a second, staring at the floor as a cold feeling settled into my chest. Richard had seen everything. Not just pieces of it. Everything. I continued reading. "Jessica cares deeply about controlling perception. She needs to be admired, and she becomes uncomfortable whenever attention belongs fully to someone else. Especially you." My fingers tightened around the page. Every strange interaction over the past several years suddenly rearranged itself in my memory with painful clarity. The interruptions. The subtle corrections. The way Jessica always positioned herself as the reasonable one whenever conflict appeared. Richard had understood the pattern long before I allowed myself to see it. Then I reached the final paragraph. "I asked Pastor Reynolds to give you this privately because I know there may come a moment when people make you feel small in your own story. If that happens, remember this plainly. You were the center of my life long before anyone else entered this family, and you remained the center of it until my final breath." I covered my mouth with my hand as tears finally slipped down my face. Not dramatic tears. Not unstable tears. Just grief. Honest grief from a woman who had loved one man for 42 years. Then I heard footsteps outside the lounge door, followed by Jessica's voice speaking softly to someone in the hallway. "I just want to make sure Margaret is not isolating herself too much." I stared at Richard's letter again, especially the line about silence. And for the first time all day, instead of feeling embarrassed by my emotions, I began feeling something else entirely. Clarity. When I walked back into the reception hall, something inside me had settled. The grief was still there, heavy and sharp beneath my ribs, but the confusion was gone. Richard's letter had done something I did not think was possible anymore. It reminded me who I actually was before everyone else started quietly redefining me. Conversation softened slightly as I entered the room again. I noticed people watching me the way they had all afternoon, cautiously, politely, almost expectantly. They were waiting to see whether I would cry again or disappear, or become another delicate situation Jessica needed to manage. Instead, I walked calmly toward the large photo display near the center of the hall. Jessica noticed immediately. She excused herself from a conversation and moved toward me with that same composed expression she wore whenever she sensed something shifting outside her control. "Margaret," she said gently, "are you feeling better?" Better. As though my grief were some temporary inconvenience everyone hoped would pass quietly before dessert was served. I looked at the photographs again, this time more carefully. The missing years stood out even more now. Entire decades of my marriage erased from view while Jessica smiled from frame after frame beside my husband. Suddenly I reached toward one photograph near the back of the display. It showed Richard sitting on our porch swing 3 summers earlier, smiling toward someone outside the frame. The original picture had included me beside him. I remember because I had taken that photo timer myself after our anniversary dinner. But now only half my shoulder remained visible at the edge where the image had clearly been cropped. "This one used to include me," I said quietly. Jessica's face barely changed, but I saw the flicker in her eyes. "Oh," she replied smoothly. "I just thought Richard looked especially handsome in that shot." Nearby conversations began slowing as a few guests subtly turned toward us. Jessica noticed it too because her smile sharpened almost invisibly. "You know how emotional memories can become during grief," she added softly, almost like she was helping explain me to the room again. But this time something different happened. Before anyone could nod sympathetically, I calmly removed the folded letter from my purse. "Richard remembered very clearly," I said. Silence spread faster than I expected. Jessica stared at the envelope the moment she recognized the handwriting. Daniel, standing across the room near the coffee station, looked over immediately. "Dad wrote you a letter?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "Yes. And in it, he mentioned something important." Jessica folded her hands together carefully. "Margaret, maybe this is not the best time." "Actually," I interrupted quietly, "I think this is exactly the time." That single sentence changed the atmosphere of the room. For the first time all day, Jessica no longer looked completely comfortable. Guests who had spent hours admiring her composure suddenly seemed uncertain, curious, waiting. I unfolded the letter carefully while my heart pounded hard enough for me to feel it in my throat. Then I looked directly at my son before reading aloud the one sentence Richard clearly needed someone else to hear too. "Peace is not real when one person slowly disappears inside it." The room became so quiet after I read Richard's words that I could hear the faint ticking of the decorative clock above the reception table. Nobody moved for several seconds. Guests stood frozen with coffee cups halfway raised. Conversations abandoned mid-sentence. Even the funeral staff near the back hallway had stopped walking. Jessica remained perfectly still beside the photo display, but her expression had changed in a way I had never seen before. The confidence was still there, carefully arranged across her face, yet underneath it was something sharper now. Concern. Daniel looked between us uncertainly. "Mom," he said slowly, "what exactly did Dad mean by that?" I unfolded the letter more carefully in my hands. "I think he meant that silence can become its own kind of disappearance," I answered quietly. Jessica let out a soft breath and stepped closer with a sympathetic expression that probably would have convinced me a few hours earlier. "Margaret," she said gently, "I do not think Richard would want tension today." Several guests nodded faintly at her words. Normally, I would have backed down immediately to avoid making people uncomfortable. But then I looked again at Richard's handwriting. "No," I replied calmly. "Richard wanted honesty." That sentence landed differently in the room. I saw it in people's faces. Tiny shifts. Small uncertainties replacing automatic agreement. Jessica folded her arms loosely, still smiling, but her voice tightened slightly around the edges. "Of course. But grief can sometimes make people interpret things emotionally." There it was again. Another careful attempt to position me as irrational without directly saying it. Only this time people noticed it too. I saw Daniel glance toward her briefly with a faint crease between his eyebrows. I continued reading from the letter. Margaret spent years protecting this family from discomfort, including discomfort she did not deserve to carry alone. My throat tightened as I read the next line. If anyone ever makes her feel like she is too emotional for loving me deeply, then they never understood our marriage in the first place. A woman near the dessert table quietly lowered her eyes. Pastor Reynolds removed his glasses slowly. Even Daniel looked stunned now. Jessica's smile flickered for the first time all afternoon. I think maybe this private letter is being misunderstood, she said carefully. But her voice no longer sounded smooth. It sounded defensive. Private. I repeated softly. You spent this entire day explaining my emotions publicly. Complete silence followed. Not dramatic silence. Not explosive. Just the uncomfortable stillness that arrives when people suddenly realize they may have judged the wrong person. Jessica looked around the room quickly, sensing it too. For hours, she had controlled the emotional atmosphere with gentle suggestions and perfectly timed concern. But Richard's words had done something she could not easily manage. They shifted attention away from my grief and toward her behavior. Daniel stepped closer to me slowly. Mom, he said quietly, Dad really wrote all this? I nodded once. Every word. Then I folded the letter carefully and looked directly at Jessica for the first time without uncertainty, apology, or hesitation. And in that moment, she finally understood something that had not been true all day anymore. I was no longer disappearing quietly. Jessica tried to recover quickly. I could almost see her reorganizing the room in her mind, searching for a way to regain control of the atmosphere she had carefully shaped all afternoon. She let out a small measured sigh and placed one hand gently against her chest. I think emotions are running high for everyone right now, she said softly. Maybe we should stop reading private things publicly before more misunderstandings happen. Normally, that tone would have worked. Calm, reasonable, concerned. But something had changed in the room after Richard's letter. People were no longer automatically accepting her interpretation first. They were listening differently now. Watching differently. Daniel looked especially unsettled. His eyes moved from Jessica to me and back again like he was seeing a conversation that had been happening silently for years without fully noticing it until now. Mom, he asked carefully, why did Dad think you were disappearing? The question hurt more than I expected because the answer suddenly felt so obvious. I folded the letter slowly before speaking. Because little by little I stopped correcting things, I said quietly. I stopped arguing when people interrupted me. I stopped pointing out when decisions got made without me. I kept telling myself keeping peace mattered more than being heard. Jessica crossed her arms lightly. Nobody was trying to silence you, Margaret. Her voice remained controlled, but there was strain underneath it now. No, I answered calmly. Not directly. Silence settled over the room again. Several guests looked visibly uncomfortable, especially those who had spent the entire afternoon reassuring Jessica about how strong and graceful she seemed. I noticed Daniel's Aunt Patricia staring at the photo display with narrowed eyes now, clearly noticing the missing family photographs for the first time. Then Pastor Reynolds stepped forward quietly. Richard spoke. Very highly of Margaret constantly, he said gently, especially during his illness. He often mentioned how devoted she was to him. Jessica's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Of course she was devoted, she replied quickly. Nobody is denying that. But her words came too fast this time. Too defensive. The polished calmness was slipping. Daniel suddenly looked toward the photo display himself. Wait, he said slowly. Why are there barely any pictures of Mom and Dad together? Jessica immediately answered. We only had limited room for the boards. There were 6 boards, Patricia said flatly from across the room. Nobody spoke after that. Jessica looked genuinely cornered for the first time all day. Not exposed dramatically. Not publicly humiliated in some explosive scene. Just unable to smooth over the growing discomfort anymore. And that discomfort spread quietly through the room like people waking up from the same dream at once. I looked at my son carefully. He seemed exhausted now, but not from grief alone. From realization. Daniel, I said softly, your father loved peace, but he never wanted me erased in order to create it. My son lowered his eyes immediately. I could tell from his expression that he was replaying years of family dinners, holidays, small conversations, and subtle moments he had ignored because they seemed easier not to examine too closely. Jessica opened her mouth to speak again, but this time nobody looked toward her immediately. And for someone who survived by controlling perception, that silence around her was louder than anything I could have said. Nobody argued after that. The reception hall slowly filled with a different kind of silence now, one shaped less by grief and more by reflection. Guests who had spent the afternoon orbiting around Jessica began quietly drifting away from her side. Some moved toward me instead, hesitant at first, almost embarrassed. Richard's sister Patricia touched my arm gently and whispered, "I am sorry, Margaret. I should have noticed sooner." I simply nodded because I did not trust myself to speak yet. Daniel stood near the photo display for a long time staring at the missing spaces where pieces of our family history should have been. He looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before, as though an invisible structure inside his mind had suddenly collapsed. Finally he walked over to me slowly. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think I missed a lot." I looked at my son and saw the little boy who used to wait at the front window every evening for Richard to come home from work. The same boy who once cried for 2 hours when his pet turtle died at age 9. Somewhere along the way, adulthood and marriage and comfort had taught him to ignore tension instead of question it. "You loved your father," I said softly. "That is what matters right now." Daniel lowered his eyes. "I should have protected you better today." For the first time all afternoon, nobody interrupted him. Jessica stood across the room beside the coffee station, strangely alone now despite the crowd surrounding her. She still looked polished and composed from a distance, but the effortless control she carried earlier had disappeared completely. People were polite to her, but cautiously polite. Measured. No longer instinctively trusting every soft explanation she offered. And that shift mattered more than any dramatic confrontation ever could. I folded Richard's letter carefully and placed it back inside my purse. The grief inside me remained enormous, but it no longer felt tangled together with shame. That was the difference. Earlier that morning, I had walked into the funeral home feeling like an inconvenience people needed to manage delicately. Now I finally understood something Richard had spent years trying to show me. Staying silent to preserve peace only works when everyone values your dignity equally. Otherwise, silence simply teaches people how small they are allowed to make you. Pastor Reynolds approached quietly and offered me my coat. "Richard loved you very deeply," he said softly. I smiled through tears. "I know." Outside, the evening sky had already darkened into deep winter blue. Guests slowly began leaving the parking lot while cold wind moved through the trees beside the chapel. Daniel carried my purse to the car without being asked. Behind us, Jessica remained near the entrance, speaking quietly with a few remaining guests, but for the first time all day, her voice no longer controlled the emotional center of the room. Richard still did. And somehow, through one honest letter written in his familiar careful handwriting, he had given me something far more valuable than revenge. He gave me my place back. As Daniel opened the passenger door for me, I looked once more at the funeral home glowing softly against the dark Connecticut evening. Then I climbed into the car not as a fragile widow people needed to manage carefully, but as Richard Whitmore's wife.